The wind howled over the vast plains as the sun began to sink behind the distant mesas, casting long shadows across the lonely homestead of a man who had chosen to live far from the noise of civilization. His name was Daniel McGraw, a seasoned frontiersman who had built his life with his own hands, log by log, fence by fence. That evening was supposed to be like any other, quiet, cold, and still. But fate had its own plans. And it started with a sound, a weak, trembling cry carried by the wind. Daniel rose from his chair on the porch, gripping his old rifle out of instinct, his blue eyes narrowing toward the tree-line. Something was moving out there. Something, or someone, small. He stepped forward, boots crunching on the dry dirt. Then, through the dimming light, he saw her. A young Comanche girl, no older than 13. Stumbling out of the brush. Her dress torn, her knees bleeding. And her eyes wide with fear. She collapsed near the fence. Daniel rushed forward, kneeling beside her. "Easy now," he whispered, his voice gruff but steady. "You're safe here." He didn't know where she came from, but he could tell she'd run a long way. And she wasn't just tired, she was terrified. Her lips moved soundlessly, speaking in a language he barely understood. But her trembling hands, clutching his arm, said more than words ever could. She needed help. Daniel carried her inside, laying her gently on the cot near the fire. He wrapped her in a warm blanket, offered water, and stitched up the worst of her wounds. Her skin was cold, her pulse faint. He kept the fire burning through the night. Outside, coyotes sang their mournful songs to the moon, and the wind whispered through the cottonwoods. Daniel knew enough about the frontier to understand what he was risking. This was Comanche land. No settler in their right mind would dare interfere with tribal matters. But when he saw the girl's small, fragile frame and the bruise on her cheek, he made his choice. "Ain't nobody hurting you again," he muttered, tightening his jaw. She stirred in her sleep, whispering a single word, "Father." Morning came with a crimson sky. The girl woke slowly, startled at first but calming as Daniel offered her warm bread and stew. She ate like she hadn't seen food in days. When he asked her name, she hesitated, then whispered, "Taya." Daniel nodded. "Taya," he repeated, letting the name settle in the quiet air. It wasn't long before the signs began. Birds took flight in nervous clusters. The horses out back began to stomp and snort. The ground trembled ever so slightly beneath his boots. Daniel stepped onto his porch, squinting toward the horizon. At first, it looked like a heat mirage, a shimmer in the distance. But then it grew, shadows on horseback. Black hair flowing, lances glinting in the morning sun. One rider became 10. 10 became 50. 50 became 70. And at their head rode a tall, broad-shouldered man with a feathered headdress flowing down his back and eyes as sharp as an eagle's. Daniel's blood ran cold. The Comanche had come. Taya froze when she saw them from the window. "Father," she whispered again, this time with a mixture of hope and fear. Daniel exhaled slowly. Her father was the chief. That explained everything. The warriors fanned out in a semicircle around the house, their ponies stamping the earth, their lances pointed high, their war paint blazing in reds and blacks. Daniel knew this wasn't just a visit. This was a warning. Step out of line, and they'd burn the place to the ground before noon. The chief rode forward, stopping a dozen paces from the porch. He raised his hand in a gesture that was not quite a threat, but not peace either. Daniel lowered his rifle slightly but didn't let go of it. "She's safe," Daniel called out in a firm voice. "I didn't harm her. She came here hurt." The chief stared, his face unreadable, then spoke in his language. Daniel only caught fragments, but Taya understood. She slipped out the door, barefoot, clutching the blanket around her. "Father!" she cried, running toward him. Two warriors started to pull her back, but the chief raised his hand again. She reached him, wrapped her small arms around his waist, and began to speak rapidly, tears streaming down her cheeks. For a moment, time froze. Daniel's heart pounded like a war drum. He knew what some tribes did to white men who touched their daughters. Shelter or not, this could end badly. Then the chief dismounted, walking toward Daniel with the weight of a man who carried both power and pain. "Why?" the chief said finally in broken English. Daniel met his eyes. "Because she was hurt. Because no one, Comanche or settler, should be left to die alone." The chief's jaw tightened. He turned to Taya, then back to Daniel. "You protect my blood?" Daniel nodded once. "Yes." The air grew tense again. 70 warriors, 70 sets of eyes. One wrong move, and blood would stain the ground. But then something unexpected happened. The chief extended his hand. Rough. Calloused. Strong. Daniel hesitated only a second before grasping it. The men stared at each other, and a silent understanding passed between them. Not friendship, but respect. The chief signaled to his warriors, and the circle loosened. Some still glared at Daniel with hatred burning in their eyes, but they obeyed. Taya turned back to Daniel and whispered something in Comanche. Then in English, "Thank you." Daniel nodded. "You take care of yourself, kid." She smiled faintly before climbing onto her father's horse. The warriors began to retreat. A wave of power disappearing into the horizon as quickly as it had appeared. But the chief lingered for just a moment. "You good men," he said, then rode off after his people. When the dust settled and silence returned to the homestead, Daniel leaned against the porch post, finally letting out the breath he'd been holding. He had no illusions about the dangers of the frontier. But he also knew that sometimes, just sometimes, doing the right thing could bridge even the deepest divides. That night, the stars shone a little brighter over the prairie. The wind felt softer. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt something stir in his chest, a quiet sense of peace. His story spread in whispers across settlements and camps. The tale of the lone frontiersman who faced down 70 Comanche warriors, not with gunfire, but with courage and honor. And as his porch light burned against the darkness, Daniel knew something important had changed, not just for him, but for the land itself. Some lines didn't need to be drawn in blood. Some were carved in respect. The sound of hooves faded into the distance, leaving Daniel's land wrapped in a strange, heavy silence. He leaned against the porch post, breathing slow, letting the reality of what had just happened settle deep into his bones. 70 warriors had stood on his land. 70. And yet, no blood had been spilled. Taya's small voice still echoed in his mind, soft, grateful, unforgettable. But Daniel knew the story wasn't over. When tribes gave you respect, they also watched you closely. Trust was a fragile thing in the West. The sun was dipping low again when Daniel noticed something near the fence. A small pouch, made of deerskin, tied with a red thread. Taya must have dropped it, or maybe left it on purpose. Inside was a single eagle feather and a smooth river stone, carved with a symbol he didn't recognize. A gift, perhaps. Or a message. He tucked it into his coat pocket, feeling a strange warmth. That night, Daniel barely slept. Wolves howled in the distance, but it wasn't the sound of beasts that kept him awake. It was the thought of the chief. A man like that didn't ride with 70 warriors for nothing. There was meaning in every step, every gesture. This wasn't just gratitude. It was a bond, a fragile bridge between two worlds always at war. At dawn, Daniel saddled his horse. He didn't know why, but something told him to ride toward the river where the Comanche trails crossed the plains. When he reached the ridge, he saw them. Not an army this time, just Taya and her father, waiting beneath a cottonwood tree. She smiled when she saw him. And the chief raised his hand, not in warning, but in greeting. The chief stepped forward and placed his hand over Daniel's chest. "Brother," he said simply. Daniel's throat tightened. No long speeches. No promises. Just a single word that carried the weight of trust. As they rode back in silence, Daniel realized the prairie had changed for him. He wasn't just a man living on the edge of a wild land anymore. He had become part of something bigger, a story whispered between two worlds.